Hello there, my gentle souls. Tonight, beneath the soft glow of a town that never quite forgot its secrets, we wander into the story of the Gilberts, a family built from love and loss, from old houses and older mysteries, from the particular courage of ordinary people living at the edge of something extraordinary. Mystic Falls holds many stories in its soil, but none quite like this one. So, settle in. Let your breath slow, and let the warmth of this family carry you somewhere gentle, somewhere safe, into a story about what it truly means to hold on. There is a house on the edge of Mystic Falls that has always known more than it lets on. It sits on a quiet street lined with old oaks, their branches wide enough to shelter the whole yard in shade during summer, their roots deep enough to remember things the town has tried to forget. The porch light stays on late. The windows glow amber in the evening. From the outside, it looks like exactly what it is supposed to look like. A family home, warm and inhabited and ordinary. From the inside, it is something more complicated than that. The walls have absorbed decades of conversation. The floorboards carry the memory of footsteps. The kitchen table has hosted arguments and reconciliations and homework sessions, and the particular silence of people who love each other sitting together without needing to speak. Every room holds its own history, and the house itself holds the history of the family that has lived in it across multiple generations. A family whose roots in this particular Virginia town go all the way down to the founding, all the way down to the moment when a group of families looked at a piece of land and decided not just to settle it, but to protect it. The Gilberts have lived in Mystic Falls since the town's beginning. Their name is pressed into the original council documents, alongside the Salvatores and the Fells, and the Lochlins and the Foresters, the families who built something in this corner of Virginia and chose to stay and defend it long after the building was done. Founding family status in Mystic Falls carries weight beyond the civic and the ceremonial. It carries memory. It carries obligation. It carries the particular burden of knowing, generation after generation, that the town you love has a shadow beneath it that most of its residents will never see. That the pleasant rhythms of ordinary life in a small Virginia town rest on a foundation that the founding families have been quietly maintaining for over a century. Most of Mystic Falls goes about its days without any awareness of what lives in that shadow. The founding families do not have that luxury. They are the ones who agreed long ago to know. And knowing, they agreed to act. And acting, they agreed to keep the peace by whatever means were necessary, including the ones that could never be spoken of in polite company. Grace and Gilbert understood that shadow with the clarity of a man who had grown up inside it. He had been raised by a father who spoke plainly about the history of Mystic Falls and what the founding families existed to protect against. though those conversations had always been conducted in the careful, almost clinical register of people who believe that precision of language can keep darkness at a manageable distance. Grayson had absorbed that precision entirely. He became a doctor, a healer by vocation and by temperament, a man who believed with genuine conviction that most problems, given enough knowledge and enough care and enough willingness to sit with difficult truth, could be brought toward resolution. He had chosen medicine not as an escape from the darker dimensions of his inheritance, but as a complement to them. A doctor understood the body's vulnerabilities. A doctor understood what it meant to fight for life with whatever tools were available. A doctor understood, more intimately than most, the precise distance between living and not. He carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had examined that distance and made his peace with it. His patients trusted him without entirely knowing why, responding to something in his manner that suggested he would not flinch at what he found, that he had the steadiness to receive difficult news and to deliver it with honesty and without cruelty. His neighbors respected him with a particular respect reserved for people who contribute more than they take, who show up reliably and competently and without requiring recognition for it. He served on the Founders' Council the way his father had, attending the meetings that happened below the surface of the town's civic life, making the decisions that the town's safety required without advertising that such decisions were being made. He was, in the fullest sense of the word, a good man. Not a perfect one, a good one, which is the more interesting and more difficult thing to be. Miranda Gilbert had come to Mystic Falls from outside, had married into the founding family legacy rather than being born into it, and had embraced that legacy with a wholehearted clarity that sometimes surprised even Grayson, who had spent his whole life carrying it. She was warm where he was precise, instinctive where he was measured, possessed of a social intelligence that complemented his more analytical disposition in ways that seemed almost designed. She could read a room and a heart in the same unhurried glance, could identify the unspoken need beneath a stated one, and address it so naturally that the person being helped often did not notice they had been. She managed their home with a practical love that showed itself in remembered preferences and cleared schedules and the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who have decided that the people they love are worth paying attention to, fully and consistently, and without making a performance of it. She had chosen Grayson deliberately, had chosen Mystic Falls with open eyes, had understood what the founding family covenant required, and had decided it was something she could live with and perhaps even honor. She never appeared to regret any of it. If she had private reservations, she kept them in the private place where people who love their families tend to keep the things they do not want to burden those families with. She was, in her own way, as steady as her husband, just warmer about it. Their daughter Eleanor was 17 when the story that matters most begins, and she was, in the way of children who have been genuinely loved, substantially formed by that love without fully knowing it. She moved through the world with an openness that had not yet learned to defend itself, with a generosity of assumption that believed the best of people until they demonstrated otherwise, with a loyalty so constitutive it was less a quality she possessed than a quality that possessed her. She was not naive. She had grown up with enough awareness of loss and complication to understand that the world did not always arrange itself according to what people deserved. But she had been given, by Grayson and Miranda, and the house on the quiet street, and the life they had to build together, the foundational conviction that love was worth the risk of its loss, that connection was worth the vulnerability it required, that the right response to a world capable of taking everything was to give everything anyway. That conviction lived in her the way the most important things live in people, below the level of conscious choice, in the body and the bone, surfacing in moments of pressure as a thing that turned out to have been there all along. Her brother Jeremy was 15, and he was the kind of person who was easier to misread than to understand, which was not his fault. He carried himself with the easy physical comfort of someone who moved through his environment without particular anxiety, which could read as indifference to people who were not paying close attention. He was not indifferent. He was, beneath the surface ease, intensely responsive to the world around him, alert to its textures and undercurrents in ways he had not yet developed language for. He drew constantly, filling the margins of notebooks and the backs of worksheets with images that were better than he gave himself credit for. The kind of drawing that reveals observation rather than just technique. He noticed things people assumed he had missed. He felt things people assumed had not registered. He was his father's son in the depth of his capacity for dedication, and his mother's son in the instinctiveness of his emotional responses. And he was, at 15, still in the process of becoming the person those inheritances would eventually compose. The becoming was not always comfortable. Becoming rarely is. The Gilbert house held all of them with the unself-conscious grace of a home that has been genuinely inhabited for a long time. Books lined the shelves with the cheerful disorder of a collection that had grown by accretion over years, organized by some original system that had been complicated by additions and never quite restored. Framed photographs covered the side table in the hallway. Grayson and Miranda caught mid-laugh at what appeared to be a Founders' Day event, both of them slightly blurred, the image more alive for its imprecision. Elena, at some indeterminate age between child and teenager, squinting into summer light with an expression that was somehow already entirely her. Jeremy holding up a drawing for the camera, his face caught between pride and the particular embarrassment of being caught caring about something. On the desk in Grayson's study, journals sat in a row, their spines worn with handling, their covers darkened at the edges where hands had gripped them over many years. The handwriting inside was dense and careful, the handwriting of a man who believed that what he was recording mattered and wanted to record it accurately. Eleanor had seen those journals her entire childhood. She had never once thought to wonder what they contained. They were simply part of the house's texture, and as unremarkable as the creak of the third stair or the particular smell of old wood that deepened every autumn when the season turned. The Founders' Council existed in the background of her childhood, the way significant adult matters generally exist in the background of childhood. Present, occasionally audible, understood to be important in a way she was not yet required to understand. There were dinners with the other founding families, where the conversation had a quality she could not quite name, a careful quality, as if certain topics were being navigated around with practiced ease. There were meetings her father attended that he described briefly and accurately as civic business and did not elaborate on. There were conversations that paused when she entered rooms and resumed after she left. I conducted in the particular register of adults who have agreed not to discuss something in front of children and have become skilled at the pause and the resumption. She had catalogued all of it without assembling it into anything resembling a picture. It was the furniture of adult life as she understood it, private, important, not yet her concern. What she could not have known was that the house she moved through so easily was a kind of archive, that the journals on her father's desk were not merely the private reflections of a thoughtful man, but records, systematic and specific, of a history that the town of Mystic Falls had been actively managing for generations, that the founding family legacy she had grown up treating as a source of mild civic pride was in fact a covenant renewed in every generation between the families who knew what moved through Mystic Falls after dark and the town that trusted them, without knowing it was trusting them, to stand watch. The Gilbert bloodline carried something particular, something that distinguished it even among the founding families who all carried more than they advertised. Jonathan Gilbert, the family's patriarch in 1864, had been more than a civic architect, was a scholar of the supernatural, a man who had trained his attention on the darkness that other people looked away from, and had decided that understanding it was more useful than fearing it. His journals, the originals, documented his observations of the vampires who moved through Mystic Falls during that period, his careful relationships with the Bennett witches who had lived in the town across many generations, and most significantly, his development of a device that he believed represented a genuine advance in the founding family's capacity to protect their town. The device operated on a frequency specifically designed to incapacitate vampires, to render them vulnerable in the moments when vulnerability was necessary, to give the human families who were responsible for maintaining Mystic Falls' safety a reliable means of doing so against opponents who were stronger and faster and far more difficult to destroy than ordinary weapons could address. Jonathan Gilbert had built this device with the methodical care of a man who believed in practical solutions to supernatural problems, and he had documented every step of its creation in the journals that would eventually sit on his great-great-grandson's desk, unremarkable and unread, waiting for a moment of crisis to make themselves necessary. That moment had not yet arrived. Grayson knew about the device, had handled it, understood its function, made certain careful decisions about its existence that he kept largely to himself, as he kept most things pertaining to the darker dimensions of his family's history. He was protective not from shame, but from the measured conviction of a man who believed that the right time to tell someone a difficult truth was when they had sufficient context to carry it without being crushed by its weight. Elena did not yet have that context. She was 17, and her life was full in the way that lives feel full when they are still largely intact, and when the people who anchor them are still present, and the future still feels like open territory, rather than a series of losses to be navigated. She had her parents. She had Jeremy, difficult and tender, and still becoming himself. She had Bonnie Bennett, whose grandmother's quiet mystery sat around her like an inheritance she was only beginning to understand. and whose own warmth and humour and fierce protectiveness made her the kind of friend who felt less chosen than essential. She had Caroline Forbes, whose brightness was so relentlessly organised, it sometimes obscured the fear beneath it, the fear of being insufficient, of being overlooked, of caring more than the people around her cared in return, a fear that Eleanor had always understood without Caroline ever fully articulating it, as she had the easy rhythms of a small-town life she sometimes chafed against, without knowing yet how much she would one day want it back. The rhythms of the football games and the founders' events, and the grill on Friday evenings, and the particular quality of a town where everyone knew your name and your parents' names and your grandparents' names, where history was not abstract but personal, where the past was always close enough to touch. She had no reason to look beneath it, no reason to open the journals on her father's desk, or to ask what the Founders' Council was actually protecting Mystic Falls from, across all those generations of civic dinners and careful silence. No reason to wonder whether the ordinary warmth of her ordinary life rested on something she had not yet been given the language to name. She had no reason to, and so she did not. And the ordinary life continued in the amber light of the house on the quiet street. Homework spread across the kitchen table, Miranda's voice from the next room, the sound of the television Jeremy was only half watching, Grayson with his newspaper and his careful private knowledge, and his daily choice to protect his children from what he knew for as long as protection was possible. The oak trees stood in the yard, the porch light stayed on. The house held its history in its walls and waited, as houses do, for what was coming next. There are moments that divide a life so cleanly that everything before them belongs to a different story. The person who existed on one side of such a moment is recognizable, familiar, continuous with everything that came before. The person who exists on the other side is someone new, and someone still wearing the same face and carrying the same memories, but fundamentally altered in ways that will take years to fully understand. Most people encounter one or two such moments across the length of a life. Eleanor Gilbert encountered hers at 17, on a rain-slicked bridge over a dark river, on a May evening that had begun as ordinarily as any other. The 23rd of May began without ceremony. It was the kind of spring evening that Mystic Falls did well, warm enough to suggest summer without quite committing to it, the air carrying the particular sweetness of late flowering things and recent rain. Elena had been at a party with her friends, the ordinary social ritual of a high school evening, and whatever had happened there, whatever small dramas of friendship and attraction and teenage navigation had played out, none of it would survive the night as anything worth remembering. What would survive was the drive home. The rain that had begun during the party, soft at first and then heavier. The bridge over Wickery Creek, familiar and unremarkable, crossed hundreds of times without incident. And then the moment when the car went through the railing and into the water below, and the world, as Eleanor Gilbert had known it, went with it. Grayson and Miranda Gilbert died on Wickery Bridge. The specifics of how the accident happened, the precise sequence of events in those seconds between the railing giving way and the car hitting the water, belong to the category of things that accident reports document and survivors cannot fully access. The memory fragmented by shock and water and the body's own emergency response to mortal danger. What is known is that the car went into the river, that the water was dark and cold and disorienting, that Eleanor survived, pulled from the wreckage by a young man she would not remember meeting until much later, a stranger who appeared at exactly the moment the river would otherwise have claimed her, who brought her to the surface and to the bank, and who disappeared before anyone could ask who he was or where he had come from. His name was Stefan Salvatore, though Elena would not know that yet. She would carry only the blurred sense of hands in the dark water and air reaching her lungs again, and then the bank, and then the particular silence of a night that had become completely different from the night it had started as. Grayson and Miranda did not come up from the water. Grayson Gilbert, hag who had spent his adult life understanding the distance between living and not, crossed that distance on a May evening on a bridge he had driven over without counting. Miranda Gilbert, who had chosen this life and these people and this town with clear eyes and no apparent regret, did not get to choose how it ended. They were gone with the abruptness that real loss always carries, the abruptness that no amount of understanding mortality in the abstract ever quite prepares a person for when it arrives in the specific. Elena woke in a hospital, and the world had already rearranged itself around an absence so large she could not yet see its edges. The grief did not arrive all at once. It came in pieces, in the space between sleeping and waking, in the moment each morning when consciousness returned and the knowledge returned with it, fresh and terrible each time, that her parents were not somewhere in the house downstairs. It came in the specific and unexpected places that loss always finds. The habit of reaching for her phone to tell her mother something. The reflex of expecting her father's car in the driveway. The dinner table that was now the wrong size for the number of people sitting at it. Jeremy was 15 and had lost both parents on the same night, and he received this information in the way that 15-year-olds receive information that exceeds their capacity to process it, which is to say he received it and then continued receiving it for months, the understanding deepening and darkening as time passed, and the absence failed to become any less absolute. He was old enough to understand what death meant, and too young to have developed any real architecture for bearing it. He went quiet in the particular way of people who are feeling too much to express any of it. The feeling turned inward, pressurizing, looking for release in the wrong directions. And then there was the question of what happened next. Elena and Jeremy were minors. The house, the life, the daily logistics of two young people who had just lost their parents required an adult. And the adult who arrived was their mother's younger sister, Jenna Summers, who drove to Mystic Falls from her own interrupted life with a mixture of love and bewilderment and determination that the situation demanded and received. Jenna was 24 years old. She was not prepared for parenthood. No one had suggested she would need to be, and then suddenly she needed to be. And she arrived and she stayed because leaving was not something she was willing to consider, even though the shape of what she was taking on was large and uncertain, and would require her to set aside plans she had made for a version of her life that no longer included this particular emergency. She moved into the Gilbert house and learned its rhythms by immersion, learned which kitchen cabinet held what, learn the school schedules and the friend group dynamics and the particular emotional weather of two grieving teenagers who expressed their grief in almost entirely opposite ways. Elena organized and managed and held things together with a competence that was also, if you knew where to look, a way of not stopping, of keeping motion as a substitute for the stillness in which grief waited. Jeremy withdrew and then acted out, and then withdrew again, the pattern cycling through the weeks with a consistency that was itself a kind of communication, though not one that was easy to respond to. The drug use started quietly, the way these things tend to. Jeremy had always known where to find the people at school who could offer numbness in a form that was easy to carry in a pocket and easier to explain away than the actual thing being numbed. He was not looking for pleasure. He was looking for the off switch, for whatever would interrupt the frequency of loss long enough for him to breathe without it hurting quite so much. The people who loved him noticed. Elena noticed with a particular sharpness of someone who was also watching everything else, and who had appointed herself the family's early warning system in the absence of anyone better suited to the role. Jenna noticed with a helpless concern of someone who was doing her best in a situation her best had not been designed for. They intervened in the ways available to them, and it helped partially and temporarily, and then stopped helping, and the cycle continued. Grayson's study sat largely undisturbed in the weeks after his death. Ilana would stand in the doorway sometimes, looking at the desk with its careful arrangement of papers and the row of journals with their worn spines, feeling the proximity of something she was not ready to approach. The journals were her father's private record, his inner life committed to paper in the handwriting she knew as well as her own, and the thought of opening them carried the double weight of grief and the specific intimacy of reading what a person wrote when they believed only they would read it. She left them where they were. There would be time, or there would not be time, and they would remain closed, and either way she could not manage them yet. What she could manage, or what she told herself she was managing, was the surface of daily life. The house needed to function. Jeremy needed to eat and attend school and be accounted for. Jenna needed support, even as she was trying to provide it. And Elena understood this instinctively, understood that the person who had come to hold them together was also grieving, was also navigating something she had not signed up for, was also just barely keeping her own structure intact beneath the competent exterior she maintained for their benefit. So Elena held Jenna up quietly, while Jenna held her up loudly, and together they made something that functioned, imperfectly but genuinely, as the scaffolding of a continuing life. Bonnie came to the house almost every day in the weeks after the accident, arriving with the reliable warmth of someone who understood that presence mattered more than words, and who had enough sense not to try to fill the silence with reassurance that would have landed wrong anyway. She sat with Elena. She helped with ordinary things. She was simply there, a tip which was the only thing that was actually useful, and the thing that most people in crisis find hardest to provide because it requires sitting with someone else's pain without attempting to fix it. Bonnie sat with it. Caroline came too, bringing the particular energy of someone who expresses care through action, through organizing and doing and making sure things were handled, which was its own form of love even when it occasionally needed redirecting. Between them, they surrounded Elena with the imperfect but genuine support of people who were also 17 and doing their best with tools they had not finished developing yet. Summer passed in the way that summers pass through grief, slowly in the days and quickly in retrospect. The heat and the long evenings providing a backdrop that felt wrong for the season of loss, too bright and too warm for what was being felt inside it. Elena went through the routines of summer with the cooperative compliance of someone who understood that routines were necessary even when they felt hollow. That hollow routines were better than no structure at all. She spent time at the lake. She went to Bonnie's house. She drove past Wickery Bridge several times, not quite stopping. The bridge becoming a place she felt compelled to approach and unable to fully confront. The sight of everything and therefore too large to simply look at directly. By the time September arrived and the new school year began to organize itself on the horizon, Elena was in the condition that people who have spent a summer in grief sometimes reach by autumn, not healed, not remotely healed, but somewhat accustomed to the new weight of things, and somewhat more familiar with the shape of the absence, somewhat more capable of carrying it without being entirely defined by the carrying. She was not the person she had been in May. She would not be that person again. She was someone new, still in the early stages of understanding what that meant, standing at the beginning of a school year that would turn out to contain more change than any year she had yet lived through, though she could not have known that yet. She stood at the edge of her changed life and looked toward what came next. And what came next, as it turned out, was everything. The journals on her father's desk, the strangers who were not strangers, the shadow beneath the town she had grown up loving without knowing what it contained. All of it was coming and moving toward her with the patience of things that have been waiting for a long time and are not in any particular hurry, because they know that eventually the person they are moving toward will stop running and turn around and look directly at what has always been there. Eleanor Gilbert was about to turn around. She did not know it yet, but the bridge was behind her and Mystic Falls was ahead, and the autumn was beginning, and the story was only just starting to show her what it actually was. September arrived in Mystic Falls the way it always did, with the slow cooling of air that had been too warm for too long, and the particular quality of light that came when the sun dropped lower in the sky, and everything it touched turned slightly more golden than it had been in August. The trees were beginning to consider changing. The school parking lot filled again with familiar cars and familiar faces and the social arrangements that had been in suspension over summer, and now resumed with the slightly altered dynamics that 3 months of separation always produced. Eleanor Gilbert walked back into Mystic Falls High School, carrying everything the summer had given her, which was mostly loss, and trying to look like someone who was ready for what came next. She was not entirely ready, but she was present, which was the decision she had made, and presence was what she had to offer. The hallways were loud in the way school hallways are loud after a long absence, the noise carrying a particular energy that was almost physical. The collective relief of teenagers who had spent months in the relative quiet of summer and were now reassembling the social world that gave their days structure. Eleanor moved through it with Bonnie beside her, and Caroline on her other side, talking at the pace she always talked, when she was managing anxiety by filling silence. And the texture of it was familiar enough to be almost comforting, almost normal, almost the shape of the life that existed before May. And then the morning shifted. He was standing near the office when Elena first saw him, a new student completing the administrative formalities of enrollment, his attention directed toward the papers in front of him. He was tall, dark-haired, with a kind of stillness about him that made him noticeable, even before he looked up, and a quality of self-containment that was not aloofness exactly, but something more like self-sufficiency, the manner of someone who was accustomed to existing in his own company and had made a kind of peace with it. When he did look up, his eyes found hers with a directness that felt less like coincidence than like something that had been arranged without her knowledge. His name, she would learn, was Stefan Salvatore. What Elena felt in that first moment was difficult to name with any precision, and she would spend considerable time afterward trying to name it anyway, because it was not the ordinary experience of finding someone attractive, which she understood well enough, but something with more gravity to it, something that felt less like beginning and more like recognition, as if some part of her knew him from a context she could not access. She looked away. She kept walking. She told herself it was the strangeness of the new school year and the rawness of grief making everything feel more significant than it was. Stefan Salvatore had come to Mystic Falls knowing exactly what he would find there. He had not come by accident, had not followed some vague instinct or passing curiosity. He had come because of Elena, because a vampire who had lived for over a century and a half had heard that a girl in a small Virginia town bore a face he had last seen in 1864, and the impossibility of that had been sufficient to pull him from wherever he had been and set him moving toward Mystic Falls with the careful deliberateness of someone who had learned over many decades and to approach the things that mattered to him with patience rather than urgency. He had loved Catherine Pierce in 1864, or he had believed he loved her, which at 17, human and newly arrived in a world that contained vampires and desire and the intoxicating mixture of both, had felt like the same thing. Catherine had been beautiful and dangerous and entirely unconcerned with the damage she caused, which was its own form of magnetism, when you were young enough not to understand yet that indifference to damage and freedom from consequence were not the same as strength. He understood it now. He had had 145 years to understand it. Catherine had used him, had used his brother Damon, had used them both in the particular way of people who collect devotion without intending to return it, and the cost of that had been enormous and had stretched across a century and a half in ways that neither Salvatore brother had fully finished paying. And now there was a girl in Mystic Falls with Catherine's face, and from every indication he could gather at a careful distance, an entirely different interior. He needed to understand the connection. He needed to be close enough to see what it was. And so, he enrolled in Mystic Falls High School, settled into the old Salvatore boarding house that had belonged to his family across the generations, and presented himself to the town as something it could absorb without alarm. A new student, a young man, unremarkable on the surface. What he had not expected was how quickly unremarkable became impossible to maintain. around Elena Gilbert. Their first real conversation happened in the cemetery. Of all the improbable and perfect locations, where Elena had gone alone in the early days of the school year to sit near her parents' graves in the particular privacy that cemeteries provide for people who are still in the active work of grief. Stefan was there visiting the graves of his own family, which he could do without arousing suspicion, because the Salvatore name was old enough in Mystic Falls to make his presence at a family plot look like nothing more unusual than a descendant paying respects. They spoke the way strangers speak when they find themselves unexpectedly sharing a space that neither of them expected to share, with the slightly heightened quality of attention that comes from the intimacy of the location. "I didn't mean to intrude," Stefan said, pausing a few feet from where she sat. "I can go." "No," Elena said, and then she was faintly surprised by how quickly the word came. "It's fine. I come here to think. I guess other people do too." "My family," he said, gesturing toward the older section of the grounds. "There's a long history here." "Mine too." She looked at the fresh stone with her parents' names on it, though mine is a lot more recent. He sat down at a distance that was respectful without being distant, and they were quiet for a moment, and the quiet was not uncomfortable, which was itself unusual enough to be worth noticing. "I heard about what happened," he said carefully. "I'm sorry about your parents." "Thank you." She'd said those words so many times since May that they had become almost automatic, a social response she delivered without fully inhabiting it. But something about the way he said it made her inhabit it this time. I made her feel the words rather than just produce them. She looked at him. "You're the new student, Stefan. And you're Elena." He almost said something else, caught himself, offered a small and slightly complicated smile instead. "Mystic Falls isn't a large town." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She thought about that conversation for the rest of the day, in the way you think about things that were simple on the surface and somehow not simple underneath. There had been nothing remarkable about what was said, and yet the quality of his attention had been remarkable. The sense of someone who was actually listening rather than waiting for his turn to speak, who was present in the conversation in a way that she had not encountered much recently, and surrounded as she was by people who loved her, but were also managing their own responses to her grief, and therefore never quite fully available to simply receive her. The days that followed arranged themselves into a pattern that Elena did not immediately recognize as a pattern because she was inside it. Stefan appeared with the reliable frequency of someone who was also attending her school, which was unremarkable and sufficient cover for the fact that he was also with great care and genuine intention, making himself available to her. They talked between classes. They talked after school in the increasingly natural way of people whose paths keep finding each other. He listened. He asked questions that were interested rather than interrogating. He was, she found herself thinking, I'm the first person since her parents died who made her feel like herself, rather than like someone performing the role of a person recovering from loss. Do you ever feel like grief is something you're supposed to finish? She asked him one afternoon, sitting at the edge of the Salvatore property where the grounds met the woods. Like there's a timeline and everyone is waiting to see if you're staying on it. Stefan was quiet for a moment. It was the kind of quiet that meant thinking rather than hesitation. I think people who say that haven't lost anything they couldn't imagine losing, he said. The things that matter don't resolve. You just learn to carry them differently. She looked at him. How do you know that? I've had some experience with loss, he said. And there was something in his voice that was older than the face it came from. A quality of weight that she noticed without knowing yet what to do with it. Meanwhile, beneath the surface warmth of these early weeks, Mystic Falls was arranging itself around a darkness it had been managing in various forms for over a century. There were animal attacks reported on the outskirts of town, the kind of attacks that the local paper described with the careful vagueness reserved for events that do not have an explanation the paper is willing to print. Livestock found drained. A hiker injured under circumstances that the sheriff's department had classified as a wild animal incident without notable conviction. Elena heard these things the way you hear news items from your hometown, when you are preoccupied with other concerns, adjacent to your attention, registered without being fully absorbed. Jeremy was preoccupied with his own concerns, which had become increasingly visible. The withdrawal that had characterized his grief over summer had begun to express itself in new ways, in the company he was keeping and the hours he was keeping, and the specific quality of his eyes when he came home in the evenings, a quality that Eleanor recognized and that frightened her in the straightforward way that one person's self-destruction frightens the people who love them. He had found Vicky Donovan, who was older and damaged in ways that Jeremy's own damage recognized and was drawn toward. Either specific attraction of two people who are hurting in compatible directions. Jenna watched and worried and intervened with the limited effectiveness of someone whose authority was real, but whose standing was uncertain, who was not a parent and knew it, who was doing her best in the permanent awareness that her best had not been designed for this. Eleanor watched Stefan in the hallways at school and felt something she had not expected to feel so soon. Something that was not forgetting what she had lost, but was genuinely separate from it. A warmth that coexisted with the grief without diminishing it. She was suspicious of this feeling in the way of people who have recently learned that good things can be taken without warning, and who have therefore developed a wariness of goodness itself. She wanted to trust it. She was afraid to trust it. She did not yet know that the boy she was falling toward had pulled her from a river in May. Did not know that the face she was learning to find familiar was the face of someone who had seen her at her most vulnerable and had chosen, without being asked and without staying to be thanked, to bring her back to the surface. She did not know that Stefan Salvatore was the reason she was alive, or that the reason he had been at Wickery Bridge that night was connected to a history that reached back further than her parents' deaths and further than her own birth, to a year in a town and a face that had started something that was still, after 145 years, not finished. She knew only what was in front of her. A boy who listened, who was present, who made her feel like herself again in the specific and irreplaceable way that the right person at the right moment can restore something in you that you had begun to believe was gone. It was not the whole story. It was not even close to the whole story. But it was the beginning of her finding her way back to herself, which was, for now, sufficient. The rest would come. It always did in Mystic Falls. The rest always came, wearing whatever face the town required, arriving precisely when the person it was meant for had just barely stopped bracing for it. There's a particular kind of devastation that comes not from losing something, but from discovering that what you thought you had was never entirely what it appeared to be. Helena Gilbert had already lost her parents. She had already learned, through the long, difficult work of a grief-saturated summer, to carry that loss through the daily routines of a life that continued whether or not she felt ready for it to continue. What she had not yet lost, what she was about to lose, was the simpler version of the world she had grown up inside. The version where the darkness her father had quietly managed was still abstract, still someone else's concern, still safely contained within the journals she had not yet opened and the meetings she had not been invited to attend, and the careful silences of adults who believed that protection meant keeping certain truths at a comfortable distance. That version of the world ended on an autumn evening when Stefan Salvatore told her the truth about what he was, and the truth turned out to be larger and older and more consequential than anything she had been braced for. Even in a year that had already taken more from her than she had known she could survive losing. She'd been gathering evidence without knowing she was gathering it. The speed she had glimpsed at moments when he thought she was not paying attention. Movement that resolved too quickly into stillness to be accounted for by any ordinary explanation. The strength she'd observed in situations where it surfaced despite his careful management of it. An instinctive response to something threatening that revealed capability well beyond what his apparent age and build should have produced. The way he sometimes went still with a completeness that no living person achieves unconsciously, and the stillness of something that was not regulating itself by habit but by decision, as if every natural motion of a living body was something he had to remember to perform, rather than something that happened on its own. She had catalogued these details in the part of her mind that collected things it did not yet have a framework for, the part that waits with patient thoroughness for enough pieces to arrive that they can be assembled into something coherent. By the time Stefan sat across from her and said the words, some significant portion of her had already been moving toward them for weeks. It did not make hearing them easier. What I'm about to tell you, Stefan said, is going to be difficult to believe. I need you to let me finish before you decide what you think. She looked at him across the space between them, her reading the quality of his expression with the attention she had been giving his face for weeks now. The attention of someone for whom a face has become important and who has therefore become fluent in its variations. What she read was not the expression of someone about to say something constructed or convenient. It was the expression of someone about to say something true that they had been carrying alone for a very long time and had made the difficult decision to stop carrying alone. Tell me, she said. I'm a vampire, Elena. The words landed in the silence of the room and remained there, taking up space, demanding to be received. She did not speak immediately. She was aware of the impulse to laugh, to dismiss, to reach for some more manageable explanation that would allow the world to remain the shape she had understood it to be, to let him be eccentric or troubled, or speaking metaphorically rather than literally. She was also aware, with a clarity that cut through the impulse cleanly, that she was not going to do any of those things, because she had seen what she had seen, because the pieces she had been collecting suddenly had an arrangement that made them coherent, because some part of her, the part that had grown up in a founding family house full of careful silences and journals she had never been invited to read, and conversations that paused when she entered rooms, already knew at some level that Mystic Falls contained dimensions that most of its residents were not equipped to understand and had been quietly protected from understanding. "How long?" she asked, which was not the question she had expected herself to ask first, but it was the one that came, and the one her mind reached for before the larger questions had finished forming. "I was born in 1842, Stefan said. "I was turned in 1864. I have been what I am for 145 years. She absorbed this in the particular silence of someone doing rapid and significant interior work. The face across from her, which she had been learning with the careful attention you give to faces that have become necessary to you, was 163 years old. The eyes that had listened to her talk about grief at her parents' graves with such unperformed and genuine patience had been watching people grieve for longer than her entire family line could account for. The stillness she had interpreted as self-possession was the stillness of someone who had had a century and a half to learn how to be still, who had had 145 years to practice the performance of a humanity he had to work to maintain, rather than one he simply inhabited. "Catherine," Elena said, and she watched something move across his face at the name, something complicated and old. "She looked like me." "Yes." His voice was careful as the way of someone navigating around something that still had edges. "Catherine Pierce. She was in Mystic Falls in 1864. She was a vampire. She was the one who turned me and my brother." "Your brother." The boarding house. The references to family she had not pressed on. The occasional quality in his manner of someone managing the awareness of another person's behavior at a distance and finding it effortful. Damon, Stefan confirmed, when the way he said the name carried a weight that she registered without yet being able to fully interpret. The weight of a relationship that had been complicated for longer than most relationships are given the opportunity to become, that had been built and damaged and rebuilt and damaged again across a span of time that exceeded her comprehension. She stood and walked to the window and stood there looking out at the yard where the trees were fully changed now, the autumn colors deep and certain, the leaves at their most vivid just before they began to fall. She was doing the work that people do when they receive information that requires the reorganization of their entire understanding of their own life, their own history, their own family's place in the world they thought they inhabited. It was not quick work. It could not be rushed. She gave it the time it required. "The animal attacks," she said, without turning around. "The ones they've been reporting outside town. The injuries that don't have reasonable explanations." "My brother," Stefan said quietly. "Damon feeds on humans. It's what he has always done, what he has chosen to continue doing regardless of the alternatives available to him. I don't. I haven't for a very long time. What I do instead is harder in certain ways, less satisfying in the way that an approximation is always less satisfying than the real thing, but it allows me to exist among people without hurting them." She turned then. because the next question required her to look at him when she asked it. And being around me specifically, what is that for you? He met her eyes with the directness that she had learned meant the thing he was saying mattered more to him than almost anything else. Being around you is what I came here for, he said. Not to feed. Not because of what you look like or what your blood smells like or any of the things that a vampire is supposed to want from a human, but because you are Eleanor, and being near you is the first thing in a very long time that has felt like something worth being near. I would not hurt you. I need you to believe that even if you cannot yet believe anything else. She believed him. She examined the belief carefully, looking for the crack in it, the place where wanting to believe had constructed something that evidence did not actually support. She could not find the crack. She believed him, and she stayed. The history of Mystic Falls revealed itself over the days that followed, in the way that histories reveal themselves to people who have finally asked the right question, which is to say, all at once and from multiple directions simultaneously, each piece casting new light on the pieces that had come before it. In 1864, Mystic Falls had contained a significant population of vampires, drawn to the town through an accumulation of factors that included the age of the land, the concentration of old families with long memories, and a quality to the place itself that certain supernatural beings found hospitable in ways that were difficult to articulate precisely, but that their instincts recognized without difficulty. The founding families had known about the vampires, had known with the specificity that comes from direct encounter rather than inherited legend, from having looked directly at what lived in their town, and having made the decision to do something organized and permanent about it. Emily Bennett had been the instrument of that permanence, a witch of considerable power, who had moved in Catherine Pierce's orbit and had therefore been present in Mystic Falls during the period when the founding families were reaching the limit of their tolerance for what was living among them. The founding families had used their influence and their resources and Emily Bennett's magic to seal 27 vampires into the tomb beneath Fell's Church, closing it with a spell that required the Gilbert device to activate and that was designed to remain closed indefinitely, with the problem addressed with sufficient finality that the next generation would not need to revisit it. They had not designed for Damon Salvatore. Damon had not been sealed in the tomb. He had watched the ceiling from outside it, had believed in the devastation of that night that Catherine was inside, that she had been taken from him by the founding family's organized violence and locked beneath the earth while he remained above it. He had made a decision in the aftermath of that night that he had not revisited in 145 years, which was that he would open the tomb, that he would retrieve Catherine, and that nothing and no one between him and that goal was going to remain between him and it for long. He had arrived in Mystic Falls with that goal intact, in that commitment undimmed by the passage of a century and nearly half of another. His capacity for singular focus, one of the more terrifying things about him. He was also, Elena was learning, capable of a charm so practiced it had become almost indistinguishable from genuine warmth, which made him more dangerous rather than less, because it meant that the people who were most vulnerable to him were the ones who had decided they liked him before they understood what liking him cost. Vicky Donovan had not understood what it cost until it was too late to matter. Vicky had been circling the edge of Jeremy's life for weeks, the two of them drawn together by the particular gravity of shared damage and the way people who are hurting in compatible directions find each other and mistake the recognition of their own pain in another person for something more redemptive than it is. Damon had found Vicky first, had compelled her and fed on her with the casual appetite of someone who treated other people's bodies as resources rather than as the containers of entire lives. And when Vicky had already been so destabilized by his influence that her baseline functioning was compromised, he had made the decision to turn her with the detached curiosity of someone who was interested in the experiment rather than invested in the outcome. The outcome was catastrophic. Vicky Donovan turned into a vampire without preparation or support, or any of the guidance that might have given her a chance at managing what she had become. It could not contain the hunger. The transformation had amplified everything that was already precarious in her. Every instinct and impulse and need magnified beyond the capacity of someone in her condition to regulate. She was dangerous because she was suffering and could not find any way to stop suffering except through the feeding that made her more dangerous. The cycle closing on itself with terrible efficiency. Stefan killed her because there was no other way to stop what she was becoming, because the alternative was allowing her to hurt the people Elena loved, because a vampire in Vicky's state could not be reasoned with or managed or saved by any means available to him in those specific and irreversible moments. Jeremy saw it happen. Jeremy, who had already lost his parents, and who had found in Vicky something that felt like understanding, if not quite like safety, stood in the aftermath of what Stefan had done, and understood that his sister had known, that Elena had been carrying knowledge of the supernatural world for weeks, had been making decisions about what he needed to be protected from, had been, in the name of love and the instinct to shield him, keeping him in the dark about the most significant thing happening in their town. He was furious. He was furious and devastated, and the combination of those two things in a 15-year-old who was already carrying more loss than his architecture had been designed for, produced a pressure that needed somewhere to go. He asked Damon to compel him, and to reach into his mind and remove the memory of Vicky's death and what she had been and what he had witnessed, to take the sharpest edges of the recent past and smooth them into something livable. Damon did this without any apparent engagement with its ethical dimensions, because Damon in this period was not someone who experienced significant friction around the ethics of requests made of him when granting them was easy and refusing them was not particularly interesting. He simply reached into Jeremy Gilbert's mind and rearranged it, which was an act of mercy if you believed that people had the right to choose what they carried, and an act of profound violation if you believed that memory, even unbearable memory, was part of the continuous self that no one had the right to edit without the deepest kind of consent. It was probably both. Most things Damon did existed in that uncomfortable both. Eleanor opened her father's study properly for the first time after learning the truth about vampires. Not the brief appearances in the doorway she'd been managing since May, but a genuine entry, a sitting down, a decision to be in the room with what the room contained. She opened the journals with a particular combination of grief and resolve that had become her characteristic mode of approaching the things she was afraid of. The posture she had developed over a summer of being required to approach things she was afraid of, whether or not she felt ready. What she found inside the journals was her father in a fuller form than she had previously accessed. The private Grayson who lived below the public one, and the man who had been grappling with the specifics of the founding family legacy in his own handwriting across years of entries, working through the tension between what he knew and what he believed was right to do with knowing it. He had understood vampires not in the abstract but concretely, with the specificity of a man who had read the original Gilbert journals and attended Founders' Council meetings where the discussion was not hypothetical, where the decisions made were about actual entities in an actual town that he was actually responsible for helping to protect. He had known about the Gilbert device, had held it, had thought carefully about its function and its history, and the question of whether it remained relevant in the present day, or whether it was an artifact of a different approach to the problem that his generation had moved beyond. He had not resolved that question to his own satisfaction, which the journals made clear, which meant he had kept the device and kept the uncertainty together, the way people keep things they have not yet decided what to do with. He had known, in the particular way of someone who had read enough history and observed enough of mystic falls patterns, that his daughter might one day need to understand what he understood. He had been trying to determine the right moment, the sufficient context, the approach that would give her the knowledge without the damage, the inheritance without the trauma. He had not found it yet when May took him. He had been still working on it, still writing in the journals, still trying to get it right. And then the bridge had come, and the getting it right had been taken from him before he could finish. Elena sat in his chair and read his words, and felt the specific and irreplaceable grief of encountering a person more completely after they are gone than you managed to encounter them while they were present. The grief of the version of knowing someone that only becomes possible when the conversation can no longer continue, and you are left with only what they left behind, and your own reconstruction of what they were trying to say. He had loved her. That was in every line, underneath every careful consideration of tactics and history and the founding family covenant. He'd been trying to protect her from the weight of what he knew for exactly as long as he believed protection was possible. And then he had been trying to find the way to give her the weight in a form she could carry. The love was not in question. It had never been in question. What she was left with, reading his words in his chair in the study that still smelled faintly of him, was something more complicated than anger or gratitude, something that held both and had not yet resolved into either. The founding family legacy settled onto her shoulders in that room, not as a burden imposed from outside, but as something she recognized, something that had been growing in her across the years without her knowing what it was growing toward. She was a Gilbert. Gilberts, she was understanding now, were people who looked at difficult things directly, who sat with the knowledge of what their town contained and asked not how to escape it, but what to do about it. She closed the journal and looked around the room at the evidence of a man who had spent his life trying to do right by an inheritance that did not make doing right easy. And she felt something settle in her that was not peace exactly, but was something adjacent to it, a kind of readiness, the beginning of understanding not just what she had come from, but what she was for. Outside, Mystic Falls went about its evening in the ordinary way of a town that does not know what it contains. Inside the Gilbert house, in the amber light of a study full of journals and careful secrets, and the accumulated weight of a family's long relationship with the truth, our Lena Gilbert sat in her father's chair and began for the first time to understand what it meant to be a Gilbert in full. Not just the name and the house and the civic legacy, the rest of it, all of it, the shadow and the covenant and the responsibility to stand watch. She was not ready. She would not be ready for some time yet. But she had stopped looking away. And in Mystic Falls, that was always where the real story began. There is a version of Jeremy Gilbert that most people in Mystic Falls saw during the worst years of his adolescence and made the reasonable but incomplete assessment that he was a boy being lost to his own damage. They were not wrong about the damage. They were wrong about the losing. Jeremy Gilbert was not being lost. He was being built, slowly and painfully, and through a series of losses that would have broken someone with less underneath them, into something that the damage was, improbably, preparing him for. The building took years and cost more than it should have cost, and the people who loved him paid portions of that cost alongside him without being asked and without apparent resentment, which was its own testament to what he was worth to them. But the person who emerged from the other side of all that breaking was not a diminished version of the boy who had entered it. He was something more specific, more formed, more capable of the particular things the world was apparently going to require of him. He was 15 when his parents died, and 15 when Vicky Donovan died, and the two losses arrived close enough together that his grief had no opportunity to organize itself around one before the other came to complicate it. His parents' deaths had been clean in the terrible way of accidents, sudden and absolute, and without any dimension of the supernatural to make them harder to process than they already were. Vicky's death was different. Vicky's death came wrapped in the knowledge that vampires were real, that his sister had known about them and had chosen not to tell him, that the girl he had cared for in the particular fierce way of damaged people who recognize each other had been turned into something she could not survive being, and that the world he had been navigating since May was considerably more dangerous than he had been permitted to understand. He asked Damon to take the memory from him, and Damon obliged with the casual efficiency of someone for whom the interior architecture of a human mind was simply a space he had access to and could rearrange as requested. The compulsion held for a time. Jeremy moved through the weeks following Vicky's death in the smoothed over way of someone whose sharpest edges have been temporarily managed, functional in the surface sense, present enough to be accounted for. But the thing about compulsion, the thing that made it a solution of limited duration, was that it addressed the memory without addressing the grief underneath the memory, and grief that has been covered over does not thereby cease to exist. It pressurizes. It finds other channels. Anna was one of those channels, though she became considerably more than that. She was a vampire, and which Jeremy did not know when they first began talking. When he first registered her as someone who moved through the school hallways with a quality of attention that seemed more focused than the average students, who appeared interested in him in the specific rather than the general way that felt like being seen rather than being noticed. He was drawn to her with the instinct of someone who was still, beneath the compulsion-smoothed surface, looking for something that could hold the weight of what he actually felt, something real enough to matter. Anna was real. Her interest in him had begun instrumentally. She needed access to a Gilbert journal, and Jeremy was a means of obtaining it. But what it became over time was something neither of them had planned for, and both of them, in their different ways, were unprepared to manage. Had she told him the truth about what she was, he received it with the equanimity of someone who had already had the world reorganized once and had therefore lost some of his resistance to reorganization. They continued. The relationship that developed between them was genuinely tender, complicated by the history of how it began and by the impossibility of its logistics and by Anna's own history. Her mother Pearl sealed in the tomb beneath Vell's church, her existence defined by the effort to free her. Jeremy cared about Anna in the way that people care about someone they have allowed themselves to be known by, the way that feels different from other kinds of caring, because it is based on something real rather than on the performance of something real. Anna died during the chaos of Founders' Day, during the activation of the Gilbert device and the violence that followed it, killed in the fire that claimed the tomb vampires and several others besides. Jeremy held her as she died, and then he was holding someone who was no longer there, and the grief that came was layered in the way that only compound grief can be layered. This loss folded into all the previous ones, the accumulation of it reaching a mass that his 15-year-old self had no adequate container for. He swallowed Anna's blood before she died, and then he went home and took pills, enough of them to constitute a decision, or something close enough to a decision that the distinction barely mattered. He had vampire blood in his system. He did not die in the permanent way. He woke, which was its own kind of confrontation with the question of what he actually wanted, and the answer to which turned out to be more complicated than he had understood when he was looking for the off switch. Eleanor found him. The specifics of that finding, the terror of it, the relief of it, the particular horror of understanding how close she had come to losing her only remaining immediate family, were things she carried privately and at considerable cost in the months that followed. Jeremy carried the knowledge of what his own action had revealed about the state he had been in, the knowledge that he had arrived at a place where the off switch had seemed like the only available option, and the further knowledge that the off switch had not worked and that he was still here and still responsible for figuring out what here was going to mean. He began, and in the way that people begin things after surviving the thing that was supposed to end them, to look for something worth dedicating himself to. Alaric Saltzman was part of the answer. The history teacher who had arrived in Mystic Falls with his own complex reasons for being there and who had become, through a combination of circumstance and character and the particular gravitational pull of the Gilbert household, something like the adult male presence the house had been missing since May. Alaric trained Jeremy because Jeremy asked to be trained, because Jeremy had decided that if the world he lived in contained supernatural threats, then the appropriate response was to develop the capacity to respond to them. And because Alaric understood the value of giving a grieving teenager something productive to do with the energy that grief generates when it has nowhere constructive to go. The training was real. Jeremy was good at it in the way that people are good at things that align with something essential in their nature, something they were moving toward before they knew it had a name. He was focused and physically capable and possessed of the particular tenacity of someone who has already survived more than they expected to survive and has therefore recalibrated their sense of what they can endure. He trained with Alaric. He learned. He got better at things that mattered. And getting better at things that mattered was itself a form of healing. The kind that does not announce itself as healing, but simply produces over time. A person who is more capable than the person they were before. The hunter's mark appeared on his hand. It grew as he killed vampires, spreading up his arm in patterns that were not random, but intricate, deliberate, the mark of something ancient that recognized in Jeremy Gilbert the particular quality it was designed to find. The five were a brotherhood of vampire hunters created by the witch Ketsia and the original witch Silas. Hunters who carried a supernatural mandate that existed independently of their individual choices, who were called rather than recruited, who bore the mark as evidence of what they were, regardless of whether they understood or accepted what they were. Jeremy was the first potential member of the five to emerge in a generation, and which meant the mark he was growing was not just a physical change, but a piece of a larger design that reached back centuries and was moving toward a specific destination. Bonnie was beside him through much of this. Their relationship had developed from the friendship of two people who were close to Elena, and therefore close to each other, into something that was its own entirely separate thing, its own warmth and its own particular understanding. Bonnie was a witch, managing her own inheritance, her own power that kept expanding beyond what she had been prepared for, her own losses that arrived with the particular cruelty of losses that come as direct consequences of the gifts you carry. She and Jeremy understood each other across the distance of their different natures, understood the experience of discovering that you are something specific, something with a purpose attached, something that the world has claims on that you did not negotiate and cannot simply refuse. The hunter's curse arrived when Jeremy's mark was sufficiently complete, when the number of vampires he had killed passed the threshold that triggered it. The ghost came. The vampires he had killed appeared to him with the insistence of things that understood they had a right to his attention, haunting him through his waking hours with a particular effectiveness of apparitions that are not random but targeted, that know exactly which fears and guilts and losses to press on to produce maximum destabilization. He did not sleep well. He did not move through the days with the focused competence that his training had developed in him. He moved through them under siege, managing an attack that no one else could see and that therefore could not be addressed through any of the ordinary means of addressing attacks. It was Bonnie who found ways to help him manage it. It was his family, Elena, and the people the Gilberts had collected around themselves across the years, who held the space for him to endure it without being destroyed by it. And eventually, as curses do, when the conditions that maintain them shift, it lifted, and Jeremy came back to something like baseline, carrying the experience of having been haunted and survived the haunting, which was his own form of knowledge. He died at Silas's hands. Silas, the ancient being whose cure for immortality was encoded in Jeremy's completed hunter's mark, and killed Jeremy with the efficiency of someone for whom a young hunter was an obstacle rather than a person. Elena was not there when it happened. She received the news in the way that the worst news is always received, arriving before she was ready, which is to say it arrived at all, which is to say she was never going to be ready, which is to say the breath went out of her in the particular way of someone who has been hit in the place they were not protecting, because they did not believe that place could be hit again. Bonnie brought him back. She used the power of the expression triangle, the concentrated magical force of a configuration she'd been working toward without fully understanding where it was leading, and then she returned Jeremy to life at a cost she did not immediately disclose to the people who would have tried to stop her if they had known what the cost was going to be. The cost was enormous. The cost was the kind that cannot be repaid in kind, because it operates on a different scale than the ordinary exchanges of love and sacrifice, the scale where one life is measured against another and someone decides, without being asked, which one to spend. Jeremy lived. He woke into a world where Bonnie had paid for his waking with something she could not get back, and the knowledge of what she had done for him became part of what he carried, added to the existing accumulation, another weight in the particular and permanent inventory of the things that Jeremy Gilbert owed to people who had chosen him without reservation. He completed his hunter's mark. The map it contained, the path to the cure for vampirism that had been encoded in the Mark of the Five, became legible in its completion, a piece of the larger design revealing itself at the moment the design was ready to be read. Jeremy had been the key to something that mattered enormously to the people around him, had been carrying it in his own skin without knowing it, his body the archive of an answer that other people needed desperately and had been searching for across centuries. He was not the boy who had swallowed pills on a May night when the losses had accumulated past his capacity to carry them. He was not the boy who had asked Damon to take his memories because the memories were too heavy. He was Jeremy Gilbert, hunter, survivor, the person that all of that breaking had been building toward. He carrying the mark and the knowledge and the losses and the love with the particular steadiness of someone who has learned through the most demanding possible curriculum that they can bear more than they knew, and that bearing it has made them something worth being. The warrior the Gilbert bloodline had been carrying the potential for, waiting across generations for the person ready to become it. He was that person. He had become it the hard way, which turned out to be the only way it could have been done. There are people who arrive in a crisis without being asked, and stay without being thanked, and give without keeping any account of what the giving cost them, and who do all of this not because they are saintly, or because they do not feel the weight of it, but because the alternative, which is leaving, is simply not something they are capable of choosing. Jenna Summers was one of those people. She was 24 years old when she drove to Mystic Falls to become the guardian of her dead sister's children, and she was 24 years old when she died there. And in the time between those two facts, she managed to love two grieving teenagers with a consistency and a genuineness that the circumstances she was operating under made considerably more difficult than it should have been, and she never once made them feel that the difficulty was their fault. She had her own life when the call came, graduate school, or the plan of it. A version of her future that she had been assembling with the ordinary optimism of someone in their early 20s who has not yet encountered the thing that will require them to set their plans down and attend to something more urgent. Miranda had been her older sister in the full sense, the person who had helped shape Jenna's understanding of what it meant to be a Summers woman, who had been steady and warm and present in the particular way of older sisters who take the role seriously. Losing Miranda was its own enormous thing, separate from the logistics of what losing Miranda required, and Jenna was doing both simultaneously from the moment she arrived in Mystic Falls, at grieving and parenting and keeping a household functional without any of those things getting the attention it would have received if she had been able to address them one at a time. She moved into the Gilbert house and learned its particular rhythms by immersion, the way you learn things when there is no time for gradual introduction. She learned which drawer held the takeout menus and which cabinet held the good dishes that Elena always wanted to use for company, and which shelf in the refrigerator Jeremy considered his by unspoken agreement. She learned the school schedules and the friend group dynamics and the particular emotional weather systems of two teenagers who were expressing the same essential loss in almost entirely opposite ways. She made mistakes regularly and corrected them as best she could, and made different mistakes the following week and corrected those too. And the ongoing imperfection of her guardianship was not evidence of insufficient love, but of the genuine difficulty of the thing she had taken on. "I don't know what I'm doing," she told Elena one evening, sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of wine, and the particular exhaustion of someone who's been performing competence for longer than their reserves of competence actually extended. "I want you to know that I know that." Elena looked at her across the table. "You're here," she said. "That's the part that matters. It's the minimum," Jenna said. "It's not the minimum," Elena said quietly. "It's the thing." Jenna absorbed this without appearing entirely convinced by it, and which was characteristic of her. She was not someone who accepted reassurance easily, not because she was determined to suffer, but because she had a clear-eyed sense of her own limitations that made comfortable fictions feel dishonest. She knew what she did not know. She knew what she could not give Elena and Jeremy that Grayson and Miranda would have given them. And that knowledge sat with her in the small hours of the mornings when the house was quiet, and the weight of what she had taken on was most apparent. Alaric Saltzman appeared in her life with the timing of something that was either fortunate or designed. Arriving in Mystic Falls as a history teacher with a past she did not initially have access to, and a quality about him that she registered before she understood it, the quality of someone who was also carrying something significant and had become skilled at carrying it without advertising it. They met in the ordinary way of people in a small town who keep appearing in each other's peripheral vision until the peripheral becomes central, and what began as the tentative social navigation of two adults who were both, for different reasons, operating in Mystic Falls under conditions of incomplete disclosure, became something warmer and more necessary over time. "You're different than you seem," she told him once, early enough in their relationship that the observations still had the quality of discovery rather than established knowledge. Most people are, Alaric said carefully. Yes, but you specifically, Jenna said, with a directness that was one of her most consistent qualities. There's something you're not telling me. There are things I'm working out how to tell you, he said, which was honest as far as it went, and which she accepted because she had her own things she was working out how to say and understood the condition of having truth available and the right moment for it not yet arrived. What she did not know, for the entirety of her time in Mystic Falls, was the full truth of what surrounded her. She did not know that vampires were real. She did not know that Stefan Salvatore, whom she had accepted into her home because Elena cared about him, and Jenna trusted Elena's judgment in the imperfect way of guardians who understand that teenagers will have relationships they cannot control, was one of them. And she did not know that the Founders' Council her family had helped establish was not a historical society with civic functions, but an active organization managing an active supernatural threat. She did not know that Alaric, the man she was falling in love with, was a vampire hunter who had come to Mystic Falls specifically to find and kill the vampire who had turned his wife, which turned out to be Damon, who was also regularly present in their lives. She was surrounded by people who loved her and who were keeping the most significant truth of their shared environment from her, and the reasons for the keeping were real. They did not want to put her in danger, did not want to destroy the ordinary life she was trying to build for herself and for Elena and Jeremy, did not want to hand her a weight that she had not signed up to carry. But the effect of those real and loving reasons was that Jenna Summers moved through Mystic Falls in a state of managed unawareness that left her unable to protect herself from the things she didn't know were coming. She began to sense the gap. Not the content of it, not the specific shape of what was being concealed, but the existence of the concealment itself, the pattern of conversations that shifted when she entered, of explanations that were slightly too smooth, of the quality of attention people paid to her that had a component of careful management to it. Is there something going on that I should know about? She asked Elena one evening, with the precision of someone who has been accumulating small evidence and has finally reached the threshold where she needs to name what she suspects. Elena looked at her with the expression of someone navigating between love and the logistics of truth. What do you mean? I mean, Jenna said evenly, that I am not as unobservant as everyone seems to be assuming, and I would rather know difficult things than be protected from them. Elena said nothing for a moment. That was itself a kind of answer. There are things I'm still figuring out how to explain, she said finally. That's what Alaric said, Jenna said quietly, and the parallel landed in the space between them with the particular weight of a person understanding that the concealment is wider than they had estimated. She was not given sufficient time to reach the truth through the accumulation of her own observation. The truth arrived instead through Klaus, which was the worst possible way for it to arrive, and which was not an accident, but a design. Klaus Mikkelsen was the oldest and most powerful vampire Elena's world had produced, an original whose existence predated the mythology most vampires operated within, whose hybrid nature, vampire and werewolf combined, made him something that the normal categories of supernatural threat did not adequately account for. He had come to Mystic Falls for Elena, for the doppelganger blood that would break his hybrid curse, and he'd come with the architect's eye for the specific pressure points that would make the people around Elena compliant. He needed a vampire for the sacrifice ritual. He chose Jenna. He turned her on the night of the sacrifice, giving her no preparation and no choice, transforming her from a human woman who did not know vampires were real into a vampire in the space of hours, and compressing into a single terrible night the entire arc of a transformation that even vampires who had chosen it and been prepared for it found devastating. She woke into her new nature with the disorientation of someone who had been handed a manual for a life she had not applied for, with the hunger already burning in her throat and the enhanced senses overwhelming her capacity to filter them, and the knowledge, arriving in pieces, that she had been used, that her transformation was instrumental rather than chosen, that she was going to die in the ritual that Klaus had built her transformation to serve. Elena found her in the hours before the sacrifice, the two of them in the terrible intimacy of an ending neither of them had been given enough time to prepare for. "I know what's happening," Jenna said. Her voice was steadier than it had any right to be. "I'm not going to pretend I don't. Jenna." Eleanor could not manage more than her name. "I need you to hear me," Jenna said. "I need you to tell Jeremy that I love him, that I was proud of him, that he's going to be okay even when he doesn't think he is." She paused. "And I need you to know that taking care of you too was not a burden. Not for one day. Whatever it looked like from the outside, it was never that." Eleanor's voice broke completely. "You deserved more time." "Yes," Jenna said simply, without self-pity. "I did." She died in the sacrifice ritual, killed within hours of her transformation, never having had the opportunity to learn how to be what she had been made into, never having been given the choice that might have allowed her to survive it. She went into the fire with the composure of someone who had decided that if this was what the ending looked like, then she was going to meet it without flinching, because flinching was not available to her and had never been particularly characteristic of her anyway. The Gilbert house after Jenna had a quality that was different from the quality it had carried after Grayson and Miranda. Different not in degree, but in kind. Grayson and Miranda had been the house's foundation. Their absence, a structural loss that changed what the house could support. Jenna had been the person who had come to hold the remaining structure together, who had arrived after the foundation was already gone, and had positioned herself in the gap with the particular stubbornness of someone who understood that the gap needed filling and had decided she was the one to fill it. Her absence left a silence that was both grief and guilt, because the people who had loved her had kept from her the knowledge that might have let her protect herself in the name of protection, in the way that protection offered without full information is always incomplete and sometimes catastrophic. She had deserved to know. She had deserved the truth about the world she was living in, the truth about the man she was falling in love with, and the supernatural community that surrounded the family she was guarding, and the specific nature of the threat that Mystic Falls had been managing for over a century, as she had deserved to make her choices with full information, to consent to the life she was living, rather than having its most significant dimensions managed on her behalf by people whose love for her was genuine and whose judgment about what she needed to know was wrong. She had been brave and funny and imperfect and entirely committed to 2 children who had needed someone to stay, and she had stayed, and the world had taken her before it had finished with her, which was the particular cruelty of a loss that feels not just like grief, but like injustice, the sense that the account has not been settled correctly, that what was given was worth more than what was received in return. Jenna Summers had given Mystic Falls everything she had, and Mystic Falls in the end had not given her enough time to finish giving it. And there is a word for what Elena Gilbert was, a word that predated her birth by 1,000 years, and that carried within it the entire architecture of a design she had not consented to and couldn't escape. Doppelganger, a shadow self, a recurring face, a piece of supernatural machinery that the universe had been producing at intervals across 10 centuries for purposes that had nothing to do with the person wearing the face and everything to do with what that person's blood could accomplish in the right ritual at the right moment. Elena was the latest iteration of a line that stretched back to Tatia in 1000 AD, through Katerina Petrova in 1490, each one a woman who had lived her own life and loved her own people, and been used by forces older than herself for ends she had not chosen. The doppelganger line was not a gift. It was an inheritance of a specific and terrible kind. The kind that arrives without asking and leaves without apology. Elena learned about this inheritance in pieces, the way you learn things in Mystic Falls, through fragments and revelations and the gradual assembly of a picture that kept expanding every time she thought she had reached its edges. She learned that her blood was the key to breaking Klaus's hybrid curse, that the sacrifice ritual required a doppelganger, that her existence had been tracked and anticipated by forces who had been waiting for her to reach the right age and the right circumstances to be useful. She learned that the people who had known about this, some of them, had made decisions about what to tell her and when, in the way that people always made decisions about Elena, with love as the stated reason and control as the actual mechanism. The 2 things so entangled in her life that separating them had become one of her ongoing private projects. She refused to be used. This refusal was not a strategy or a tactic, but something more constitutional than that. Something in the fundamental arrangement of who she was that couldn't be negotiated with or reasoned past. She wouldn't let people die for her. She would not accept sacrifices she had not agreed to. She would not be moved around the board of other people's designs like a piece that had no say in where it was placed. This refusal cost her constantly, because the people who loved her were always attempting to protect her through means she had not authorized, and a refusal of those means looked, from the outside, like stubbornness or self-destruction, and when from the inside, it was simply the minimum condition of remaining herself. The sacrifice ritual happened anyway. Klaus was not a force that Elena's personal convictions could redirect by themselves, and the ritual that had been designed around her blood proceeded with the terrible efficiency of something that had been planned across centuries and was not going to be stopped by the preferences of the person at its center. Elena died. She was brought back by Bonnie's magic and the particular fierce love of the people who had positioned themselves around her with the intention of refusing the outcome that the ritual required. She came back changed in the way that people come back from their own deaths changed, carrying the knowledge of what it felt like to be at the center of something that treated her as a means rather than an end, and what it felt like to be loved enough that people would break fundamental rules to return her to the living. She came back and she tried to continue, and for a time she did continue in the imperfect and determined way that had characterized her approach to every difficult thing since May of her junior year. She had Stefan, she had her friends, she had the ongoing work of being Elena Gilbert in a town that kept generating new crises with a consistency that required her to be always somewhat more capable than she felt. She managed. She always managed, which was both her greatest strength and, in certain lights, the thing that made it hardest for people to understand how much the managing was costing her. And then the night on Wickery Bridge came again. Not the same night, a different night, years after the first, and a night when Rebecca forced Matt Donovan's truck off the same bridge where Elena had lost her parents, and Elena was in the truck, and the bridge claimed the water beneath it a second time with Elena in it. Meredith Fell had given Elena vampire blood without her knowledge or consent to treat a head injury. The decision made out of medical pragmatism and without any awareness of what it would mean if Elena were to die with that blood in her system. Elena drowned in the river beneath Wickery Bridge with vampire blood in her veins and woke in the Salvatore boarding house in transition, the choice already made by circumstances rather than by her. The future she had been moving toward arriving before she had finished preparing for it. Stefan brought her back from the bridge. He had been there, but had gone back for Matt first, because Elena had told him to, had followed her directive, even though following it meant she went under, because she had asked him to, and he had made the particular choice of someone who loves a person enough to respect their decisions, even when those decisions are about their own risk. He carried the weight of that choice, the way he carried most things, quietly and at considerable cost to his own peace. You should have saved yourself, Elena told him, in the first hours of her transition. That's not something I'm capable of doing, Stefan said. You need to be, she said, and she meant it, which was the thing about Elena's directives that made them so difficult to navigate around. She always meant them. She completed her transition. She fed, and the world expanded into the overwhelming sharpness of enhanced senses. The colors more saturated, and the sounds more layered, and the smell of blood carrying an insistence that she despised in herself with the same reflexive honesty she brought to everything she despised in herself. She was a vampire. The thing she had been told about, had watched others navigate, had observed at close range across 2 years of impossible proximity to the supernatural, was now her own condition, her own daily reality, the medium through which she would experience whatever came next. The transition was not graceful. Very few things about Elena's first months as a vampire were graceful, which was appropriate, because grace in that situation would have been a form of dishonesty, and Elena was constitutionally incapable of dishonesty about her own experience for any sustained period. The bloodlust horrified her, not the hunger itself, which she had been intellectually prepared for, but the intensity of it, The way it surfaced without warning and with a force that temporarily reorganized her priorities in ways she could not control. The way it made her capable of things she did not want to be capable of. She fed from a blood bag and felt the pull towards something fresher, more direct, and hated herself for feeling it. She fed from a vein when the blood bag was insufficient and felt the complicated mixture of satisfaction and self-recrimination that had apparently been Damon's condition for over a century and a half, and that she now understood from the inside. The sire bond emerged as a complication she had not anticipated. As a vampire, she was sire to Damon. Her feelings and responses calibrated toward his directives in the way of a new vampire whose transition was connected to the vampire whose blood had caused it. The question of whether her feelings for Damon were real or manufactured became the question that everyone around her had opinions about and that she had to navigate while simultaneously managing every other dimension of her new existence. She examined her feelings with the honesty she always brought to difficult self-examination and arrived at an answer that was more complicated than either side of the debate wanted it to be. The sire bond was real. Her feelings were also real. The two things were not mutually exclusive, and the fact that one existed did not mean the other was false, though it did mean she couldn't be certain where one ended and the other began, which was his own particular torment for someone who valued clarity about her own interior life. She had loved Stefan first, had loved him with the quality of love that is also recognition, the sense of finding in someone else a reflection of your own values and your own aspirations, the love that wants you to be your best version. Stefan had been her first, and in some ways her deepest anchor to her own humanity, the person who saw in her what she wanted to be seen as, who had believed in the Elena she was trying to become. She loved Damon differently. Damon's love for Elena was not the love of someone who saw her best self and reflected it back. It was the love of someone who saw all of it. The fear and the stubbornness and the capacity for damage alongside the capacity for grace, who accepted the whole inventory without requiring her to curate it. He loved the parts of her that were difficult. He did not require her to be more than she was, which was both a relief and a danger, because being accepted entirely as you are, it's not always the same as being encouraged toward the person you want to become. She chose. She always chose, which was the thing about Elena that neither brother entirely understood even after years of proximity to it. She did not drift between them or fail to decide. She made active and considered choices based on what she understood to be true at each moment. And when what she understood changed, she chose again. It was not inconstancy, it was the application of her genuine values to a situation that kept generating new information. The humanity switch was not something she chose to flip. It was something she arrived at through the accumulation of losses that finally exceeded her capacity to keep feeling them. Jeremy died at Silas's hands, and Eleanor received the news in the way she had received all the worst news of her life, all at once and too fast to brace for. And the grief that came was the grief of someone who has already given everything they had to surviving previous griefs and has finally reached the place where the reserves are gone. She turned off her humanity because the alternative was being destroyed by what she felt, and she wasn't ready to be destroyed. The Eleanor without her humanity was a precise and frightening thing. She was not chaotic or randomly violent. She was clear, unburdened, operating without the weight of feeling that had defined her since she was old enough to feel anything. She burned down the house on the quiet street, the house where she had grown up and lost her parents and kept going and tried so hard for so long, and she watched it burn without the grief that should have accompanied watching it burn, which was the clearest possible evidence that the thing that made her Eleanor was not currently present in the body that bore her name. Damon found the thread. He found the specific grief, the one loss sharp enough to cut through even the anesthetized state she had built around herself, and he pulled on it with the patience of someone who had waited longer for things than this. Jeremy. The loss of Jeremy. It permitted to reach her finally, after she had spent weeks keeping it at a distance that felt like safety, landed with its full weight, and the full weight was sufficient to bring her back. She came back to feeling the way you come back to a place you have been away from long enough for its details to have sharpened in memory, everything more vivid than it was before the absence. She grieved Jeremy with the full force of everything she had been refusing to feel, and it was devastating, and it was necessary, and it was the proof that her humanity returned, was not diminished by what she had done without it, but was intact, waiting for her, the essential Elena preserved beneath the temporary architecture of numbness she had constructed. She had been a doppelganger, a vampire, a daughter, a sister, a friend, a girl who turned off her heart, and a woman who chose to turn it back on. She had been used by designs older than herself, and had refused to be only that. She had been loved in ways that complicated her, and ways that clarified her, and ways that asked more of her than she had, and she had given it anyway. She had been unmade by grief more than once, and had chosen each time to be made again, which was not the same as being unaffected, and was not the same as being unbreakable, and was something more honest than either of those things. It was the choice, repeated across years and losses and transformations, to remain, to feel, to be Elena, in all the difficulty and cost that being Elena had turned out to entail. That choice, made again and again in the face of everything that argued against it, was the most defining thing about her. Not the doppelganger blood, or the vampire nature, or the loving of the Salvatore brothers, or any of the supernatural architecture that had been built around her existence without her consent. The choice to remain herself. That was Elena Gilbert, in the end and throughout. That was the whole of it. History in Mystic Falls was never purely historical. It was not the kind of past that stayed in its designated location, that could be visited in a museum or read about in a commemorative pamphlet distributed at Founders' Day and then set down again without consequence. The past in Mystic Falls was porous, its boundaries with the present unreliable, its events continuing to generate consequences across decades and centuries in ways that the people living in those consequences often did not immediately recognize as historical in origin. The 1864 massacre was the clearest example of this porousness. What had happened beneath Fell's Church on a September night over 140 years before the story that matters most begins had never stopped happening, had never resolved into the safely finished category of things that were over. It was still moving through Mystic Falls like a current beneath the surface of the town's ordinary life, still shaping the decisions and the dangers and the loyalties of people who had not been born when it occurred, still producing costs that were being paid by people who had no memory of incurring them. The debt of 1864 was not settled. It had only been deferred, passed forward through generations with the accumulated interest of 145 years of unresolved consequence, and Jonathan Gilbert was where the documented portion of it started. In the way that family histories always begin with the first person who thought to write things down with sufficient care that the writing survived them. He was a founding father in the full sense of that designation, present at the establishment of Mystic Falls as a settled community, invested in its growth and its governance and its future with the particular intensity of someone who had chosen this land deliberately and intended to defend that choice against whatever threatened it. He was also something more specific than a civic founder, something that the commemorative plaques and the Founders' Day speeches did not capture, because the full truth of it was not the kind of thing that fit comfortably into public acknowledgement. He was a scholar of the supernatural, as a man who had arrived at his systematic interest in vampires not through inherited legend or second-hand account, but through direct and careful observation, through the particular combination of courage and intellectual rigor, of someone who looked at something dangerous and decided that the most useful response was to understand it as precisely as possible before deciding what to do about it. His journals documented everything with the thoroughness of a man who believed that recorded knowledge was the most durable form of protection, that what could be written down and preserved could outlast the person who wrote it and continue to be useful long after the original observer was gone. The vampires who moved through Mystic Falls in the 1860s were not hidden from Jonathan. He had identified them through patient observation, had catalogued their behaviors and their patterns and their particular strengths and vulnerabilities with the methodical attention of someone who understood that the gap between what humans knew about vampires and what vampires knew about themselves was a gap that could be closed, given sufficient time and sufficient willingness to look directly at what most people prefer to look away from. He documented their speed and their strength, and the way sunlight affected them, and the conditions under which they could be injured, and the conditions under which they could not. He documented the hierarchy of their social arrangements, and the way they fed, and the degree to which individual vampires varied in their capacity for violence and restraint. He was building, across years of observation, a comprehensive understanding of what he was dealing with, and the Gilbert device was the practical culmination of that understanding. His relationships with the Bennett witches who lived in Mystic Falls in that era were essential to both the knowledge he accumulated and the solution he eventually constructed. Emily Bennett in particular occupied a complicated position in Jonathan's world. A woman of considerable power, whose primary allegiance was to Catherine Pierce, but whose own moral intelligence was not subordinate to that allegiance, who could observe what Catherine was and what Catherine's presence in Mystic Falls was producing, and hold her own judgment about it separately from her obligation to serve. Jonathan and Emily had an understanding built on mutual recognition of what each of them knew and what each of them needed, a working relationship that operated across the significant social distances of their era with a pragmatism that transcended those distances without pretending they did not exist. Emily knew things about the vampire community that Jonathan's external observation could not access. Jonathan had resources and influence within the founding family structure that Emily's position made it difficult for her to engage with directly. They each needed what the other had, and they built something functional from that mutual need, which was its own kind of relationship, even if it was never a simple one. The Gilbert device emerged from this collaboration, though Jonathan built it, and Jonathan's name was the one it carried. The concept was his, and the product of years of thinking about what it would take to give the founding families a reliable advantage against beings who are physically superior to them in almost every meaningful dimension. The device operated on a frequency that was beyond human hearing, but that vampires experience as acutely and immediately incapacitating. An emission that overwhelmed the enhanced senses that were vampires' greatest advantage and rendered them temporarily helpless, unable to access the speed and the strength that made them so difficult to confront through ordinary weapons. It was precise in its targeting in theory, designed to affect vampires while leaving human bystanders unharmed. It was sophisticated for its era in the way that things built by people who have thought very carefully about a specific problem tend to be sophisticated regardless of the era in which they are constructed. And it required Emily Bennett's power to activate it completely, to channel and direct its emission in the specific way that would achieve the effect Jonathan intended, rather than simply producing a sound that traveled in all directions without discrimination. Emily had made the device work. The circumstances under which she had agreed to do so were not simple, and involving negotiations and obligations, and the particular complexity of a woman whose loyalty to Catherine existed, alongside her own understanding that what Catherine was doing in Mystic Falls was not ultimately separable from the harm it was causing and would continue to cause. Emily Bennett was not someone who made decisions without understanding their weight. She understood the weight of what she was agreeing to when she activated the Gilbert device. She made her choice and lived with the consequences of it, as she had always lived with the consequences of the choices her power made available to her, which was the condition of being a Bennett witch in any era. The night of the 1864 massacre came together with the grim efficiency of plans that have been prepared carefully, and that encounter, in their execution, asked conditions that favor them. The founding families had been organizing for months, identifying every vampire in Mystic Falls, mapping their locations and their habits, and the moments when they would be most exposed and most difficult to warn quickly enough to escape. The device was prepared. Emily's activation of it was arranged. The families who would carry out the physical work of the roundup were coordinated and positioned. On a September night in 1864, the device was triggered in the middle of the town, its emission spreading through the streets and the buildings and the gathered crowd of a Confederate encampment, and the vampires who'd been living in Mystic Falls, some of them for years, some of them integrated into the community in ways that made their supernatural nature seem almost incidental to the lives they were living, were suddenly exposed and incapacitated, unable to flee or fight with the effectiveness that would have made the founding family's plan impossible. 27 vampires were captured and sealed in the tomb beneath Fell's Church that night, driven out of their concealment by the device's emission, and then rounded up by the organized effort of families who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. Emily's spell sealed the tomb with a complexity of protective magic that was designed to be permanent, to hold against any attempt at reopening from either inside or outside, to constitute a final solution to the vampire presence in Mystic Falls, rather than a temporary containment. The founding families went home that night, believing they had done something definitive, something that would protect Mystic Falls for generations, something that would not need to be revisited because it had been handled completely. They were wrong, but they did not know they were wrong, and the belief was genuine if not accurate. Stefan and Damon Salvatore were present for all of it, and what the massacre did to them was the thing it did that had the longest reach. They had been in Mystic Falls since earlier that year, brought by Catherine and by the susceptibility of young men who had not encountered anything like Catherine, and who were therefore without adequate defenses against what she represented. They had both loved her, or believed they loved her, the distinction not available to them at the time, and Catherine's compulsion, having ensured that the feeling of freely chosen love and the reality of manufactured devotion were indistinguishable from inside. Catherine had been feeding them her blood in preparation for the transformation she intended to complete, and the massacre interrupted that preparation at the worst possible moment. The brothers carrying her blood in their systems, but not yet transitioned, occupying the terrible intermediate state of people who were about to become something, but had not yet become it. Catherine was loaded onto the wagon with the other captured vampires, or so the brothers witnessed, or so they believed they witnessed. The truth was a Catherine truth, which meant it was designed to serve Catherine's interests rather than anyone else's comprehension of events. She had escaped and had compelled a guard and fled Mystic Falls, while leaving the two men who loved her to carry the belief that she was sealed underground, a belief she maintained without apparent difficulty for 145 years, through every decade of Damon's single-minded commitment to retrieving her, and every year of Stefan's guilt about the night they died. She was gone before the tomb was sealed. She'd been gone the whole time Damon spent trying to open it. Stefan and Damon were shot that night, identified as vampire associates by the founding families and treated accordingly. They died with Catherine's blood in their systems, which meant they did not stay dead, which meant they woke in the aftermath of the massacre into the first hours of their vampire existence, disoriented and in pain, and newly possessed of senses that the world around them was not calibrated to accommodate. What they did next, how they each responded to the impossible situation of having been killed by the town they had lived in and woken as the thing that town had just spent the night trying to destroy, established the pattern of difference between them that would define the next century and a half. Stefan chose to resist his nature, to fight against the bloodlust that the transformation had installed in him, to seek out a way of being a vampire that did not require him to become something he could not respect. Damon chose Catherine, chose the project of opening the tomb, chose the sustained fury of someone who had loved completely and lost completely, and intended to make the loss reversible regardless of what that required, they both went underground in different senses of the word, and the mystic falls that had killed them continued above them for 145 years, cycling through its founders' days and its commemorations and its carefully maintained civic mythology without any acknowledgement of what it had done in 1864 or what the people it had done it to might be carrying forward. John Gilbert arrived in the present-day story carrying his own relationship to all of this history, a relationship that was more personal and more urgent than the average founding family member's engagement with the past. John had been involved with the Founders' Council for years, had travelled in the circles of people who knew what Mystic Falls' supernatural history contained, and who took active positions on what to do about it. And he had come back to Mystic Falls with a Gilbert device and a plan for using it again. His plan was to repeat 1864 in its essential structure, to use the device to expose and incapacitate the tomb vampires who had been released when the seal was finally broken, to trigger a fire at the Founders' Day celebration that would destroy them while they were vulnerable. He had thought through the logic carefully and had arrived at a conviction that was genuine, even when it was also self-serving. The particular conviction of someone who has decided that the ends he is pursuing justify the means required to pursue them, and who has organized his moral accounting so that the costs paid by others appear in a different column than the benefits he is protecting. He activated the device on Founders' Day, triggering it during the town's largest public celebration, in the middle of a crowd that included his own niece and the people she loved. The tomb vampires were exposed and vulnerable. The fire did its intended work on many of them, and Stefan and Damon, who had not been part of John's calculation in any column that required him to protect them, were also affected because the device did not distinguish between the vampires John considered acceptable losses, and the vampires he would have preferred to leave unharmed if it had been convenient to do so. Eleanor learned about all of this as she learned about everything in Mystic Falls, through the convergence of her father's journals and Stefan's account, and the direct experience of living in a town that kept requiring her to update her understanding of what had happened in it. She absorbed the history of the Gilbert device and the massacre with the particular discomfort of someone who loves their family and refuses to make that love contingent on simplifying what the family did. Jonathan Gilbert had built something that worked and had used it to harm people who, some of them, had not harmed anyone. The founding families had organized a massacre and called it protection, and built a civic mythology on top of it that celebrated the protectors without naming what the protection had cost. John Gilbert had repeated the essential logic of that original act with the same genuine conviction and the same indifference to the costs paid by the people who were not in his protected category. She kept the journals. She read them with the honesty they deserved, which meant reading them without the protective softening that grief sometimes applies to the records of people we have loved. She learned from them everything they contained, including the things that were difficult to learn, including the evidence of her family's capacity for organized violence in the name of safety. And she held that knowledge alongside the love, because the love was also true, and both things deserved to be held without either one cancelling the other out. She was a Gilbert in a town built on Gilbert decisions, and she was going to have to decide what that meant, which parts of the inheritance were worth carrying, and which parts needed to end with her. That discernment, clear-eyed and unglamorous, and arrived at through genuine reckoning rather than comfortable revision, was itself a kind of honor paid to the history she had received. Not the honor of uncritical preservation, the harder honor of honest accounting. In Mystic Falls, where the past refused to stay past, that was the most useful thing she could offer it. There is a particular kind of love that does not announce itself as love, because it arrives wearing the clothes of something else entirely. It arrives as obligation, or as circumstance, or as the simple fact of being present when presence is what is needed, and then being unable to stop being present once you have started. Alaric Saltzman arrived in Mystic Falls wearing the clothes of a man with a mission, a specific and personal and largely vengeful mission that had nothing to do with the Gilbert family and everything to do with the vampire who had killed his wife. He came with a hunter's knowledge and a history teacher's cover, and the particular focused grief of someone who has organized their pain into a project, because a project is more manageable than the raw thing underneath it. He did not come to stay. He did not come to become essential to two teenagers who had already lost more than their fair share of the people who were supposed to anchor them. He came to find Damon Salvatore, and to make Damon Salvatore answer for what he had done to Isabel. What he found instead, or in addition, was the Gilbert household, and the Gilbert household turned out to be the kind of place that was difficult to leave once you had been inside it long enough to understand what it contained. Alaric Saltzman had been a scholar before he became a hunter, a man who had gone to university with the genuine intellectual enthusiasm of someone who found history worth caring about, who believed that understanding the past was among the more useful things a person could do with their time and attention. He had met Isabel at university, had loved her with the wholehearted conviction of someone encountering for the first time a person who matched the full range of what he was capable of feeling. Isabel was brilliant and restless and consumed by an interest in the supernatural that Alaric had found in the early years of their relationship, more charming than alarming. The passionate obsession of a woman who was too intelligent to be satisfied by ordinary explanations, and who was determined to find the edges of the world's real architecture. He had married her. He had believed, and in the way of people who love someone with great conviction, that the thing they loved was also safe to love, that the passion and the restlessness would find their expression in scholarship and in their life together, and would not eventually require something that their life together could not contain. He had been wrong about that, but he had not been wrong about loving her, and the two things, the wrongness and the love, had lived in him together across the years since her disappearance, in the particular way of truths that refuse to be simplified into each other. Isabel had not died. This was the first revision his understanding of the past required when Mystic Falls began to disclose its secrets to him. She had sought out a vampire, had sought out Damon Salvatore specifically, had asked to be turned, had made the choice to become a vampire and to leave behind the human life she and Alaric had built together, because the supernatural world she had been studying from the outside had become the only world she wanted to be inside of. She had not been killed. She had chosen to leave. The distinction was not one that made the grief easier to carry, but it was a distinction that changed its shape, transformed it from the grief of someone whose person was taken into the grief of someone whose person chose to go, which was, in certain lights, a harder thing to hold. Damon had turned Isabel because Isabel had asked him to, which did not absolve Damon of the act, but did complicate the clean narrative of villainy that Alaric had organized his mission around. Damon was not innocent of harm in Mystic Falls, and was not innocent of harm in any location he had spent meaningful time in. But the specific harm Alaric had come to address was murkier than he had understood it to be, and the murkiness required him to adjust the terms of his engagement with both Damon and the town that contained him. The Gilbert ring came to Alaric early in his time in Mystic Falls, the founding family heirloom that protected its wearer from death at supernatural hands, passed to him through a chain of circumstance that felt, in retrospect, less like coincidence than like the town arranging its pieces deliberately. The ring meant that Alaric could die at a vampire's hands and return, which was a significant practical advantage for a man who was making a habit of inserting himself into situations where vampires were present and violent, and he wore it and died and came back and wore it again. The cycle becoming routine in the way that only impossible things become routine when they happen often enough that the impossible quality fades into the background of ordinary experience. What no one understood, for longer than they should have taken to understand it, was what the repeated cycle was doing to Alaric's mind. The ring protected against supernatural death by ensuring the body returned to life. It did not protect the mind against the accumulated trauma of dying multiple times, against the experience of repeatedly crossing and recrossing the threshold between living and not. Each death and return was leaving something behind, or installing something new in the interior architecture of Alaric's consciousness, a shadow self-built from the residue of the crossings, and growing more defined and more autonomous with each repetition of the cycle. The Alaric who wore the ring and taught history and coached the football team and made himself useful in the Gilbert household was not the only Alaric the ring was maintaining. There was another one developing in the darkness of the repeated dying, a version that shared Alaric's knowledge and his physical capability, but not his values, not his care for the people he had come to love, not the specific quality of his character that made him worth loving in return. The original Alaric, the version that Klaus and Esther between them eventually called into full existence, was a weapon wearing a familiar face. Esther Mikkelsen had used Alaric as the instrument of her plan to destroy her children, the original vampire she'd created and had been trying to undo for 1,000 years by creating in him a hunter with an original strength and an original's durability, someone capable of doing what no ordinary human hunter could do. This Alaric killed efficiently and without the moral complexity that had always been one of the original Alaric's most defining characteristics, moving through Mystic Falls with the focused lethality of something that had been built for a purpose and was pursuing it without distraction. He frightened people who had trusted Alaric because the face was right and everything else was wrong, because the most frightening version of a dangerous thing is a dangerous thing wearing the face of someone you love. He died when Elena died, and the two of them connected through the spell that had made the transition possible. his existence tied to hers in the way of things that have been bound together by magic that does not ask either party's preference. Elena transitioned into vampirism, and the Alaric that had been the weapon dissolved, and what remained was the brief ghost of the man who had mattered, who appeared to Jeremy in the period after his death with the particular gentleness of someone who understood that the living needed to be reassured that the dead were not simply gone. He watched over Jeremy in that liminal state with the patience of someone who had crossed the threshold enough times to be familiar with both sides of it, who understood what it looked like from the living side and what it looked like from the other. He who wanted Jeremy to know that the care did not stop when the physical presence did. Jeremy could see him because of the hunter's mark, because of the specific supernatural attunement that came with being a member of the Five. And what Jeremy saw was not a haunting, but a continuation. The Alaric who had trained him and eaten dinner at the Gilbert table and said goodnight, still present in whatever form presence takes when the body is no longer available to it. Alaric came back. The specific mechanism of his return was complicated in the way that all mystic fools' returns from death were complicated, involving the collapse of the other side and the supernatural forces that were managing that collapse and the particular intervention of people who were not willing to accept the permanent version of his absence. He returned changed in the specific ways that people return from death changed, more aware of the value of what they had been given back, more deliberate about what they chose to do with the time they had not expected to have. He returned to a mystic falls that had continued without him, that had accumulated new losses and new complexities, that needed the particular thing Alaric was capable of providing, which was the combination of Hunter's knowledge and genuine care and the willingness to be present for people who were difficult to be present for because the difficulty of their circumstances required more than most people were willing to offer. He opened the Salvatore boarding school with Caroline and the institution that would eventually become the place where children with supernatural abilities and supernatural inheritances could learn what they were and what they were capable of, in the company of people who understood that learning rather than fearing it. It was, in its way, the most Alaric thing he could have done. The scholar and the hunter and the father figure, finding a synthesis in an institution built to give the next generation what he had spent his time in Mystic Falls, trying to give Elena and Jeremy the knowledge to understand what they were, the skills to manage what their nature required, and the consistent presence of an adult who was not going anywhere. He was not a Gilbert by blood. He was not connected to the founding family legacy by birth or by name or by any of the formal structures that Mystic Falls used to organize its sense of who belonged to what. What he was connected to was the household on the quiet street and the two young people who had needed someone to stay, and the daily accumulation of choices to be present and useful and honest that constituted, over time, the most legitimate form of family membership available. "You know you don't have to keep showing up," Jeremy told him once, in the period when Alaric's presence in the Gilbert household had become established enough that its established quality was itself worth remarking on. "You have your own life." Alaric looked at him with the expression of someone for whom the statement had landed as slightly beside the point. "This is my life," he said. "This is what I chose." Jeremy absorbed this in the way of teenagers who are receiving information that matters to them and do not want to appear to be receiving it, even with everything that keeps happening. Especially with everything that keeps happening, Alaric said, and the simplicity of it, the absence of hesitation or qualification, was more persuasive than any elaboration would have been. Elena had a version of the same conversation with him in a different season and different circumstances, when she was trying to give him an exit from the obligations that had accumulated around his presence in their lives, trying to release him from the claim that grief and proximity had established on his time and his energy and his willingness to keep dying for people he had not been born responsible for. "Ah, you came here for Isabel," she said. "You stayed for us. You don't have to keep staying." "Elena," Alaric said, with the patience of someone who had had a version of this conversation before and understood that it would need to be had again. "I stay because I want to, because you are worth staying for, because Jeremy is worth staying for. That's not obligation. That's a choice I make every day and intend to keep making." She had looked at him for a long moment with the expression she had, the one that meant she was receiving something she had been waiting to hear without knowing she was waiting. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay," he confirmed. And that was the end of the conversation and the end of any remaining ambiguity about what Alaric Saltzman was to the Gilbert family, which was the man who had stayed, and which was the man who had chosen them, which was the man who had discovered in the wreckage of his original mission that what he had found was worth more than what he had come looking for, and who had had the wisdom to recognize that and the character to act on it every day for the rest of a life that kept turning out to be longer than he expected. There is a category of loss that does not fit neatly into the standard architecture of grief, because it is not the loss of something you had, but the loss of something you never had, and now understand you will never have, the grief of the missing rather than the taken. Elena Gilbert had lost Grayson and Miranda, and that loss had the specific weight of people who had been present and warm and entirely real, people whose absence was measurable against the space they had occupied. And what she felt about Isabel Fleming and John Gilbert was different, and in some ways more difficult to process because it was grief complicated by the prior absence. Grief for a relationship that had existed in potential rather than in fact. Grief for people who had been her parents without being her parents, who had given her life without giving her themselves. Isabel Fleming had been 22 years old when Elena was born, a young woman in the specific condition of someone who was too singular in her obsessions and too honest about her limitations to pretend that the life of a young mother was the life she was capable of living. She had grown up in Mystic Falls, had been high school sweethearts, with John Gilbert in the uncomplicated way of small-town young people who find each other early and believe for a time, and that finding each other early means finding each other correctly. John had loved Isabel with the possessive certainty that was characteristic of him in all things, the love of someone who identified what he wanted and organized his understanding of the world around having it. Isabel had loved John in the more complicated way of someone who was also in the process of understanding what she wanted, who recognized something real in what they had together, and also recognized that what they had together was not the whole of what she needed. The pregnancy had not been planned. Eleanor had been born into circumstances that were not designed to receive her, to two young people who were not equipped to raise her together, and who knew it with a clarity that, to their credit, they did not pretend away. The decision to give Elena to Grayson and Miranda Gilbert had been made with the specific logic available to people in that situation. The logic of wanting better for a child than you are currently capable of providing. And it had been the right decision in the practical sense while remaining, for both Isabel and John, something that did not resolve into simply right over time, but stayed complicated, stayed present, stayed a thing they each carried in different ways and with different degrees of acknowledgement. Isabel left Mystic Falls and pursued the obsession that had been growing in her since adolescence, the obsession with the supernatural world that she was increasingly certain existed beneath the surface of the ordinary one. She was brilliant and methodical, and entirely willing to go further than other researchers were willing to go, to make contact with things that other people studied from a safe distance, to place herself inside the subject of her investigation rather than outside it. She had published academic work on vampire mythology. She had corresponded with people on the edges of legitimate scholarship who were treating the same subject with the same seriousness. She had been following a thread that was pulling her somewhere specific, and the somewhere specific turned out to be Damon Salvatore. She had sought him out deliberately, which was the thing about Isabel that was both her most defining quality and her most destructive one. She did not encounter things by accident. She pursued them. She had understood enough about vampires by the time she found Damon to understand what she was asking when she asked him to turn her, to understand the mechanics of the transformation and the permanence of what she was requesting, and the cost of it in terms of the human life she would be setting down. She asked anyway, because the human life she had been living, for all its legitimate contents, did not contain the thing she had decided she could not exist without, which was access to the supernatural world from the inside rather than the outside, the knowledge that could only come from being rather than from observing. Damon turned her without particular engagement with the weight of what she was asking, which was characteristic of Damon in that period of his existence. She was a human who wanted to be a vampire and who was prepared to pay whatever it cost. He was a vampire who could provide the transformation and who had no strong reason not to. The transaction was completed, and Isabel Fleming became a vampire and disappeared from the life she had been living, from the husband who had loved her and the daughter she had given away, and the Mystic Falls she had grown up in, into the existence she had decided she could not live without. John Gilbert's grief was not the straightforward kind. He had loved Isabel in the way that some people love someone they cannot have completely, with the intensity that impossible things generate, with a particular quality of devotion that persists precisely because it has never been fully resolved into something stable and mutual. He had known about Elena from the beginning, had been part of the decision to give her to Grayson and Miranda, and had carried the knowledge of Elena's existence through every subsequent year with the mixture of protectiveness and distance that characterized his relationship to most of the things he cared about most deeply. He protected from a distance. He cared through action rather than presence, through the decisions he made and the resources he deployed and the plans he constructed. rather than through the simpler and more vulnerable form of caring that involves simply being there and being known. He arrived in Mystic Falls as an antagonist in the immediate sense, at his agenda involving the Founders' Council and the Gilbert device and the vampire problem in ways that put him in direct conflict with Stefan and Damon, and therefore with Elena. He was difficult to like and difficult to dismiss. A man whose genuine love for Elena was real, and whose methods of expressing that love were consistently damaging, who kept making the particular mistake of people who love someone without knowing them, which is the mistake of deciding what they need without asking. "You don't know me," Elena told him once, with a flat honesty she applied to difficult truths. "You know what I represent to you. That's not the same thing." John received this without visible flinching, which was one of his more consistent qualities. "Maybe not," he said, "but I know what you're worth, and I know what I'm willing to do to protect it." "That's exactly the problem," Elena said. "You decide what I'm worth protecting from without asking me if I want the protection." He did not have a good answer for that, because it was accurate, and John was not someone who defended inaccurate positions once they had been clearly identified as inaccurate. He simply continued doing what he had decided to do, which was protect Elena on his own terms, with his own methods, according to his own calculation of what she needed, because he did not know how to protect her any other way, and the alternative, which was not protecting her, was not available to him. Isabel returned to Mystic Falls working in service of Klaus's agenda. Her allegiances shifted in the way that vampires' allegiances sometimes shift over decades of existence, and the original commitments replaced by the pragmatic calculations of someone who has been navigating supernatural politics long enough to understand that survival often requires alignment with power rather than principle. She was working with John, or alongside John, or using John, the relationships between them having the same fundamental complexity that had always characterized the relationship between two people who had been deeply important to each other and had become, across the years, deeply complicated to each other instead. She met Elena. The meeting had the quality of encounters that both people had been anticipating and preparing for, and that still managed to exceed what the preparation had accounted for. Because the reality of Elena, the specific and present reality of the daughter she had not raised, it was different from the Elena that Isabel had been carrying in the abstract across the years. Elena was a person. She was a person with her own considerable interior complexity and her own clear-eyed assessment of the situation. And Isabel, who was not someone who was easily surprised by people, was somewhat surprised by her. "I don't want a relationship," Elena told her, before Isabel could attempt to construct a frame for the meeting that positioned it as something warmer than it was. "I want to understand what's happening and what your role in it is." "That's very direct," Isabel said. "I learned it from living in Mystic Falls," Elena said, "and people who aren't direct here tend to get hurt by the things they didn't say." Isabel looked at her daughter across the distance that 17 years of absence had created and maintained between them, and something moved in her expression that was not quite pride but was adjacent to it, the recognition of a quality she understood because she shared it, refracted through a person she had not known long enough to anticipate. "You're going to be fine," Isabel said, which was not what she had planned to say but was what came out. Whatever happens, you're going to be fine. She walked into sunlight not long after that conversation, her compulsion removed by Klaus as a demonstration of his control, her death engineered by the being whose agenda she had been serving and who discarded her when the serving was complete. Her last act was not a grand gesture, but a small one. Her apology delivered in the form of action rather than words. The acknowledgement that what she had done was not undoable, but that she understood, at the end, what it had cost. She took off her ring. She walked out of the shade and into the morning, and the sunlight did what sunlight does to vampires, and Isabel Fleming stopped existing in the world she had rearranged herself to inhabit, leaving behind a daughter who had not known her long enough to grieve her in the standard way, and who grieved her anyway, in the complicated manner of someone mourning what might have been rather than what was. John Gilbert's death was entirely his own choice, which was perhaps the most John Gilbert thing about it. He'd used a spell to tether his life force to Elena's during her transition, the mechanism designed to ensure that when Elena woke as a vampire, she would retain her human soul, her essential selfhood preserved in the transformation, rather than simplified by it. The spell required his life. He had agreed to this without consulting Elena, without asking whether she wanted this particular sacrifice made on her behalf, which was entirely consistent with how he had always loved her, from a position of decision rather than of dialogue. He died so that she could remain herself. He left a letter. Elena read it alone, in the quiet of the room where he had been. The handwriting on the page, the handwriting of a man who had known he was writing the last thing he would write, and had chosen his words accordingly. He told her that she was the best thing he had ever been connected to. He told her that he knew he had failed her repeatedly, and that the failing had not been from insufficient love, but from insufficient wisdom about how to express it. He told her that what he was doing was not payment for the failures, but simply what he wanted to do, what he had decided her life was worth, freely and without expectation of the kind of return that required him to still be alive to receive it. She held the letter for a long time after she finished reading it. Outside, Mystic Falls continued in its ordinary way, unaware of what had just been exchanged in this room between a father and a daughter who had never managed to find the right language for what they were to each other while both of them were living. He had loved her imperfectly and had died for her completely, and the two things together constituted the truest thing about John Gilbert, the version of him that his methods and his stubbornness and his consistent failure to simply ask what Elena needed had always obscured until there was nothing left to obscure it. He had loved her. Isabel had loved her in the insufficient and self-oriented way that Isabel loved most things, but genuinely. They had both given her life, first in the biological sense, and then in the more deliberate sense of choosing, at the end of their own, to spend what remained of them on her survival. It was not the parenting she had deserved. It was not the relationship she would have chosen. But it was what they had managed, and she held it as it was, without requiring it to have been more than it was, which was the grace she extended to almost everyone she loved, even the ones who had not been there, even the ones who had not known how. The house on the quiet street still stands. The oak trees are still wide enough to shelter the yard in summer. their roots still deep enough to remember everything the town has tried to forget. The porch light stays on. It has always stayed on. The Gilberts were not a perfect family. They were something more honest than that. They were people who lost everything and kept choosing each other anyway. Grayson and Miranda, who died trying to come home. Jenna, who stayed when leaving would have been easier. Jeremy, who broke and rebuilt himself into something the breaking made possible. Eleanor, who was unmade by grief and love and transformation and chose each time to remain. Alaric, who was not born into this family, but walked through its door and never walked back out. A family is not only the people who share blood, it is the people who choose again and again to stay. So let that be the thought that carries you now into the quiet, into the dark that holds nothing frightening, only rest. The Gilberts held on, and tonight, so can you. Sleep well, gentle wanderer. The light is still on. Good night.